In the spring of 2011, somewhere in a city most Americans had never heard of, a doctor put on a white coat, picked up a medical bag, and walked into a neighborhood to help children. That is the most innocent version of what happened. It is also, in almost every way that matters, completely false. His name was Shakil Afridi, Pakistani physician, trained at Khyber Medical College, a man who had spent years working in one of the most difficult medical landscapes on earth, rural Pakistan, where vaccines were scarce, trust was scarcer, and the government's reach barely extended past the paved roads. He was not a spy. He was not by any account a man trained for covert operations, for reading surveillance environments, for maintaining false identities under pressure. He was a doctor, and that is exactly why they chose him. Here is a question that rarely gets asked about the hunt for Osama bin Laden. Not how did they find him, not how did they kill him. They kill, but what does it take to confirm that the most wanted man in the world is hiding in a specific building, on a specific street, in a city full of Pakistani military families, without knocking on the door? That question kept some of the most capable intelligence analysts in the world awake for months. Because by early 2011, the CIA had a problem that no satellite, no intercepted phone call, no human intelligence network had been able to solve. They had a compound, they had a theory. They had, in the words of the president's own counterterrorism advisor, nothing but the circumstantial evidence. And circumstantial evidence does not authorize a military raid into a sovereign nation's territory. The compound sat in Bilal town, a quiet, mid-income suburb of Abbottabad, a city in Khyber Pakhtunkhwa province, about an hour's drive north of Islamabad. Abbottabad was not a war zone. It was not a Taliban stronghold. It was a city with tree-lined streets, a military academy, retired officers living out comfortable lives in walled residential neighborhoods. The kind of city where nothing unusual was supposed to happen. The compound itself was unusual by every standard that experienced analysts used to flag a location. 3 floors. Walls between 12 and 18 feet high, topped with barbed wire. No internet connection, no telephone landline. Trash burned on site rather than left for collection. A family that, by all observation, never left the building's uppermost floor. The residents kept buffaloes. They grew their own vegetables. They received almost no visitors. And yet the compound was valued, by one estimate, at nearly $1 million, an absurd figure for a property in that neighborhood, in that city. Someone inside that compound did not want to be found. The CIA had spent months watching, months building a picture. They had traced a courier, a man known only by a pseudonym, to this address. That courier was believed to be one of the few people Osama bin Laden trusted with communication to the outside world. But a courier proves a connection. It does not prove a presence. To get confirmation, they needed something biological, something that could not be faked, could not be misread, could not be explained away in an intelligence briefing by a skeptical official asking whether they were certain enough to risk an international incident. Bin Laden's sister had died in Boston in early 2010. Her DNA was on file with American intelligence. If they could obtain a DNA sample from a child inside that compound and match it to the sister's profile, it would establish a family connection that no other evidence could provide. The problem was getting that sample. You cannot send a CIA officer to knock on the door. You cannot intercept children who never leave for school, who never play in the street, who exist inside those walls as if the outside world does not. You cannot manufacture a reason for contact that would not immediately register as suspicious to a household operating under the kind of security discipline that had kept its most important occupant invisible for nearly a decade. But there is one thing communities in Pakistan, particularly lower-income neighborhoods, medically underserved ones, will almost never turn away at the gate: a doctor offering free vaccines for their children. This is where Shakil Afridi enters the picture. Not as a spy, not as a trained asset, but as the most credible possible face for something the CIA needed to put a credible face on. Afridi was recruited through intermediaries, a chain of cutouts, as intelligence professionals call them. People who connect an asset to an operation without ever fully disclosing who is running it, why, or what the ultimate objective is. What Afridi was told, according to later investigations, was that he was working for a foreign humanitarian organization, that the vaccination campaign was funded by international health money, that his role was to lead a genuine public health initiative in Abbottabad. This was partially true. The vaccines were real. The hepatitis B injections his team administered were medically legitimate. Children who received them received actual protection. But the program was not designed to protect children. It was designed to collect what children's blood leaves behind on a used needle. The plan was this. After each vaccination, the spent syringes, carrying trace DNA from the blood of the children inside, would be collected, sealed, and passed to CIA handlers. Those samples would be tested against the genetic profile of Bin Laden's deceased sister. A familial match would not be proof of Bin Laden's presence in an American court of law, but it would be enough. Enough to shift the calculation. Enough to move a decision from probable to confirmed. Enough for the president to sign an order. The operation required no break-in, no planted device, no informant sitting across a dinner table from someone dangerous, sweating through a conversation they could not afford to lose. It required a doctor, a team of nurses, and a neighborhood that had no reason to be suspicious of people offering to protect their children from disease. Afridi and his team did not begin near the compound. That is one of the few things the operation got right from a tradecraft standpoint. They began at the edges of Abbottabad, in the poorer outer districts. The places with the least access to regular medical care. The places where a free vaccination drive would be not just welcomed but needed. For weeks, the team moved through those neighborhoods. Nurses in white uniforms, a doctor with credentials, clipboards and coolers and the ordinary, unglamorous infrastructure of a public health campaign. Families came, children lined up, the first doses were administered, and no one asked a single question that the cover story could not answer. Here is what that means and why it matters. The operation's cover held not because of the quality of the intelligence planning, not because the legends were airtight or the documentation was flawless. It held because the community's need was real. Families in those outer neighborhoods genuinely lacked access to hepatitis B vaccines. They genuinely welcomed the team. They genuinely trusted the white coats and the medical bags because those things represented something they had been waiting for. The CIA's deception worked in those early weeks because it was wrapped around something true. But that is also exactly what made it dangerous in a way the operation's architects had not fully calculated. Because when you build a lie around a community's genuine vulnerability, you are not just using that vulnerability. You are making it part of the weapon. By the time the team began moving toward Bilal town, toward the walled compound, toward the family that never left, the cover was established. Shakil Afridi was a known face in Abbottabad. His team had a track record. They had administered real vaccines to real children. No one had any reason to look at them and see anything other than what they appeared to be. But there is a question that no one in the operations planning chain could fully answer. Inside that compound, behind those 18-foot walls, in a household run by a man who had survived a decade of the most intensive manhunt in modern intelligence history, was there someone who had already thought about exactly this kind of approach? Someone who had already considered the possibility that the most dangerous thing you can do to a man in hiding is not send soldiers. It is send someone who looks like they only want to help. The team moved into Bilal town on a Tuesday morning. There was nothing remarkable about it. A vehicle, medical bags, nurses in white, a doctor with a clipboard and a calm, professional manner that had been tested and confirmed over weeks of prior work in the outer neighborhoods. The streets of Bilal town looked like any other mid-income Pakistani suburb. Children walking, women carrying groceries, the sound of a radio somewhere behind a wall, Normal, entirely, unremarkably normal, except for one compound at the end of a lane that was not normal at all. Afridi's team did not approach the compound directly. That was the protocol. Work the surrounding streets first. Build presence. Let the neighborhood see you before you ask anything of it. Let the sight of white coats become familiar enough that no one thinks twice when you eventually walk toward a gate that is never opened for outsiders. The outer houses in Bilal town responded the way the outer neighborhoods had. Doors opened, children were brought forward, parents asked the standard questions, "What is this for? Is it free? Will it hurt?" and received the standard answers. The operation, in those first hours in Bilal town, looked exactly like what it claimed to be, but something had shifted, not visibly, not in a way that any external observer would have registered as a problem. It was a shift in the internal logic of the operation, one that had been building since the team first moved out of the outer districts. In the poorer neighborhoods, the need for vaccines had been genuine, and the welcome had been unconditional. People wanted what was being offered. The transaction was clean. In Bilal town, the demographics were different. This was not a neighborhood of medical scarcity. The families here were better connected, better resourced, more likely to have regular contact with private physicians. They were not waiting for a free vaccination drive. They were capable of asking why one had arrived on their street. One of Afridi's nurses noticed it first. Not hostility, not suspicion in any dramatic sense, just a quality of attention that felt different from the outer neighborhoods. A man at a gate who did not immediately call for his children, but instead asked a series of careful questions about which organization was running the campaign, where the funding came from, whether there was documentation. Afridi answered. The answers were prepared, the cover story held, but the nurse noted it, filed it somewhere in the back of her awareness as something that did not match the pattern of the previous weeks. She did not know she was working for the CIA. She did not know what the used needles in the sealed bags were for. She knew that something about this neighborhood felt different, and that the difference mattered, and she did not know why. That gap between what she sensed and what she was permitted to understand is one of the most dangerous conditions an intelligence operation can create in the people it relies on. Here is what the CIA's planners understood about the compound. The household operated under strict security protocols. No internet, no phone. Residents who did not move freely in the neighborhood, did not socialize, did not engage with the ordinary commercial and social rhythms of the street. What the planners had assessed was that this insularity was defensive, designed to prevent outward leakage of information about who was inside. What they had not fully assessed was whether that insularity was also outward-facing, whether the household had protocols not just for preventing information from leaving, but for managing anything that arrived uninvited at the gate. A vaccination drive is something that arrives uninvited. A doctor with a clipboard, offering something for free, with no appointment and no prior relationship, is, if you are thinking clearly about operational security, exactly the kind of approach you prepare for. The first interaction with the compound came on the third day of the Bilal town campaign. A nurse approached the gate, standard approach, clipboard, cooler. The practiced, unhurried manner that had opened dozens of doors in the weeks prior. The gate opened partially. A man, not Bin Laden, not anyone identifiable, spoke to her through the gap, listened to the explanation, looked at the documentation. There was a pause that lasted longer than any pause in the outer neighborhoods. Then he said the children were not home. The gate closed. The nurse returned to Afridi. She told him what had happened. The closed gate, the pause, the answer that could not be verified or challenged. Afridi relayed it up through the cutout chain. The response that came back was not an abort order. It was an instruction to return, to try again, to treat the first refusal as ordinary caution, the kind any careful household might show to an unannounced visitor. Try again. This is a decision that deserves to be examined. because the instruction to try again, in an operation built entirely on the assumption that repeated contact would not generate suspicion, rested on a calculation about the household's psychology that no one in the chain had a reliable basis for making. They did not know how the people inside the compound thought about risk. They were making assumptions. The team returned. This time, the gate opened wider. A woman, one of the compound's residents, received the nurse at the door. According to later reporting, the nurse entered. She was inside the compound. She administered at least one injection to at least one child. She carried recording equipment. She had the sealed bags for the used needles. She had everything required to collect what the operation needed. What happened next is where the accounts diverge. One version, she collected samples. They were passed up the chain. The CIA tested them and found them inadequate, contaminated, insufficient, or simply inconclusive against the reference profile from Bin Laden's sister. Another version, the collection never happened cleanly at all. The interaction was managed in a way that prevented the nurse from obtaining a usable sample. The child was vaccinated. The needle was collected. But the DNA on it did not yield what the analysts needed. Both versions arrive at the same place. The samples failed. At the Langley end of the operation, this produced a specific kind of crisis, not panic. Intelligence organizations do not panic on paper. What they produce instead are reassessments, revised timelines, requests for additional collection attempts. But underneath the formal language of reassessment, there was a problem that no additional attempt was going to solve cleanly. The compound's residents had now seen Afridi's nurses twice. A household operating under genuine security discipline would already be running its own calculation. Why has this team come back? Is this normal? What is the correct response to a second visit from people we do not know? Every additional attempt did not just risk exposure. Every additional attempt was itself evidence that the team had a specific interest in this particular household. The operation was, by its own logic, becoming more dangerous with every iteration. There were conversations, at levels of the operation that Afridi was not party to, about whether to pull the program entirely. The raid was already in advanced planning stages. The SEALs were training in a purpose-built replica of the compound in a classified location. The intelligence picture, even without the DNA confirmation, was building toward a threshold. Some analysts argued the vaccination program had already served a secondary purpose, mapping the compound's internal response patterns. How many people came to the gate? Who spoke to outsiders? How the household managed an unexpected approach. This was intelligence. Not the intelligence they had designed the operation to collect, but intelligence nonetheless. Others argued that continued operation was net negative. That the risk of alerting the household, of triggering a movement, a disappearance, a departure that would send the entire manhunt back to zero, outweighed any remaining collection value. The program was not immediately aborted. It continued in a reduced form. Whether that decision was correct is a question that was never formally answered because events overtook it. Now, here is where the assumption made in Phase 1 breaks. The operation was designed on a foundational premise that the compound's residents would respond to a vaccination drive the way ordinary Pakistani households responded. That the community cover, once established, would grant access that nothing more direct could achieve. That premise held in the outer neighborhoods. It held in Bilal Town, partially, briefly, enough to get a nurse through a gate. But there is a possibility that no account of this operation has ever been able to fully rule out. The household may not have been deceived at all. Not in the way the operation required. They may have accepted the vaccination, let the nurse through the gate, allowed the injection, said the ordinary things that a household says to a health worker, while simultaneously knowing, or strongly suspecting, that the visit was not what it claimed to be. If that is true, then the sample collection did not fail because the nurse couldn't get close enough. It failed because the household controlled exactly what samples she got. A child vaccinated. A needle collected. DNA obtained. just not the DNA of anyone the CIA was looking for. There is no confirmed evidence that this is what happened, but there is also no confirmed evidence that it isn't. And that gap between what the operation believed it was collecting and what it may actually have collected is the uncertainty that sits at the center of everything that followed. The CIA believed the program failed because the collection was technically inadequate. They may have been right. Or the deception may have been running in both directions the entire time, and the people inside those walls may have let it run because letting it run was safer than closing the gate a second time. The instruction that came down was simple. One more attempt, final approach. If the compound refused contact again, the program would be stood down and the collection objective would be marked as unachieved. One more attempt. Afridi received it the way a man receives an instruction he has already been turning over in his own mind, not as new information, but as a formalization of something he had already been dreading. He had been in Bilal Town long enough now to understand something the operations architects in Langley had not accounted for. Neighborhoods talk, not in any conspiratorial sense, not in the way of informants or surveillance networks, in the ordinary, inevitable way that people who live near each other exchange information about the things that happen on their street. A vaccination team that had visited twice in 2 weeks was already a topic of conversation in Bilal Town. He had heard it himself, a comment from a man at one of the neighboring houses, casual, not suspicious. Just the ordinary notation of a pattern, you people have been here before. It was said without hostility. It landed like a stone. Afridi made a decision that was not authorized. Before the final approach to the compound, he sent the team to 2 additional houses on the same lane, houses they had already visited, families who had already received the first injection in the series. The stated reason, if anyone asked, was follow-up, checking on reactions to the first dose, considering a second visit before moving to the next phase of the campaign. The actual reason was cover. If the compound was watching the street, and Afridi had, by this point, developed a private conviction that it was, then he needed the approach to look like part of a broader movement, not a targeted return. He told no one above him what he had done or why. He was a doctor running a vaccination campaign. He was making a judgment call about field logistics. That is what he told himself. The 2 additional house visits went without incident. Families welcomed the team, children were seen. The ordinary choreography of a community health visit played out the way it had been playing out for weeks. And Afridi felt something he had not felt since the team moved to Bilal Town. He felt like it was working. That feeling, the sense that the cover was holding, that the approach was landing as intended, that the operation was proceeding according to its designed logic, was the most dangerous thing that happened that day, because it was based on the wrong evidence. The families who welcomed the team were not the family he was trying to reach. Their openness told him nothing about what waited at the end of the lane. He read the afternoon's success as confirmation of the evening's safety. It was not. The approach to the compound came at the end of the day, late afternoon light, the street quieter than the morning. The kind of hour when a health team wrapping up its day's work would naturally make a final call before packing up the coolers. The nurse who had entered the compound on the previous visit led the approach. She had been briefed more carefully this time, not about the operation's true purpose, which remained invisible to her, but about the specific interaction. How to extend the contact. How to position herself in relation to the child during the injection. How to manage the needle collection in a way that maximized the sample's viability. She had practiced it. She was ready. She walked to the gate and knocked. Nothing. 30 seconds, 45, a minute. She knocked again. The gate opened, not the full width of the previous visit, but a narrow gap, and a different face appeared. Not the man from the first visit, not the woman from the second. A younger man. Teenager, possibly. Unreadable expression. He listened to the explanation, the campaign, the follow-up, the documentation held up for his inspection. He looked at it for a long time. Then he said he needed to get someone. The gate closed again. She stood at the gate for 4 minutes. This is not a dramatic estimate. It is close to the actual duration reported in subsequent accounts of the operation. 4 minutes is a long time to stand at a closed gate on a quiet street in a neighborhood that had already noticed your team twice. She held the clipboard. She held the cooler. She did not look at the other houses on the lane. She did not check whether anyone was watching from a window. She stood and waited because standing and waiting was the correct behavior for a health worker who had been asked to wait. Inside, she was making her own calculations, the ones she had never been equipped with the right information to make correctly. The gate opened again. The woman from the second visit. Calm, composed, giving away nothing in her face or her posture. She said the children were resting. She said the family had already received the injection at the previous visit. She said, with the particular finality that does not require emphasis to communicate itself, that they did not need a follow-up today. Then she said something that the nurse would later describe as the thing that stayed with her longer than anything else from the entire campaign. She said, "We appreciate what you are doing for the neighborhood." Past tense, a closing. A thank you that was also a dismissal. The gate closed for the third and final time. The nurse walked back to where Afridi was waiting. She relayed exactly what had happened. The different face at the gate, the 4-minute wait, the woman, the words. Afridi listened without interrupting. When she finished, he did not speak for a moment. Then he began repacking the medical bag that had already been packed. It was a displacement behavior, something to do with his hands while he processed what she had told him. The thing he was processing was not, primarily, the operational failure. It was the phrase, "We appreciate what you are doing for the neighborhood." A woman in a household that did not interact with the neighborhood, had no relationship with it, had made a point of existing apart from it, had used the word neighborhood as though it were a connection she shared with the people standing at her gate. It was the right thing to say. It was too right. The correct response to a health worker you are turning away is a polite refusal, a brief explanation, perhaps an apology, not a commendation, not a statement that positions the household as part of the same community fabric the vaccination campaign was designed to serve. Afridi had spent enough time in enough Pakistani households to understand, on some level he could not fully articulate, that the response had been constructed, not improvised. Constructed. He relayed the outcome up through the cutout chain that night. The program, as instructed, was stood down. The response he received was clinical, acknowledged. Next steps to follow. No debrief. No request for his analysis of what had occurred at the gate. No question about whether the household's behavior had suggested anything beyond ordinary caution. He was a doctor who had run a vaccination campaign. His role in the operation's analytical machinery was to deliver samples, not assessments. He had delivered neither. What happened next contains the false release that operations of this kind almost always produce. In the days after the program was stood down, Afridi's team continued working in the outer neighborhoods, completing visits, administering second doses where first doses had been given, doing the visible, documentable work of a legitimate public health campaign reaching its natural conclusion. The team's presence in Abbottabad became, in those final weeks, something close to genuinely unremarkable. They were winding down. They were doing the follow-up work that responsible health campaigns do. The cover, paradoxically, had never been more convincing. And because it was convincing, because the team's presence had resolved into something that looked like ordinary completion rather than operational retreat, Afridi allowed himself a recalibration. Maybe the gate had been closed for ordinary reasons. Maybe the woman's words had been exactly what they appeared to be, a polite dismissal from a private family that did not want strangers at their door. Maybe the household was cautious, not suspicious, reclusive, not informed. Maybe the operation had been turned away by privacy, not counterintelligence. It was a possible reading of everything that had happened. It was also the reading that required him to have been wrong about the thing he had felt most certain of since the afternoon at the gate. He chose it anyway, because the alternative, That the household had managed every interaction with full awareness of what the team actually was meant that the past several weeks had not been a failed intelligence operation. It meant they had been watched. And if they had been watched, the question was not whether the operation had been compromised. The question was what exactly had been allowed to happen and why. The raid happened on May 2, 2011. Afridi was still in Abbottabad when it did. Not at the compound, not involved. Just a doctor in a city that woke up to the sound of helicopters in the early hours of the morning, and the news, by daybreak, that the most wanted man in the world had been found and killed 4 streets away from where some of his nurses had stood at a gate, holding a clipboard, waiting for someone to answer. He heard about it the way everyone else in Abbottabad heard about it. From the street. The raid confirmed what the DNA collection had failed to confirm. The compound had been Bin Laden's. The family inside had been his family. The children whose DNA the operation had been designed to collect were his children. The nurse had stood at that gate, had been inside that compound, had administered an injection to at least one of those children, and had come back with nothing the CIA could use. Everything the operation had been built to prove had now been proven by 23 Navy SEALs with rifles in 40 minutes, in a way that required none of what had preceded it. Afridi was arrested within weeks, not quietly, not in the way that intelligence services prefer to manage the disposal of assets, with distance, with deniability, with the clean paperwork of someone who simply ceases to be relevant. He was arrested publicly by Pakistani authorities in a manner that signaled immediately that Pakistan intended to make the operation's existence a formal, institutional grievance. The charge was not espionage, the charge was treason, conspiracy against the state. The distinction matters. Espionage, under Pakistani law, carries specific penalties within a framework that acknowledges the existence of intelligence work between states. Treason is something else. Treason is the language a government uses when it wants to communicate that what happened was not a professional matter between intelligence agencies. It was a violation of sovereignty, a betrayal of the country itself. Pakistan was not processing a bureaucratic irritant. It was making a statement. The 15 health workers who had assisted Afridi, the nurses, the support staff, the people who had carried coolers and clipboards through Abbottabad's streets, were declared permanently ineligible for government employment. Not charged, not imprisoned, just permanently closed out of any future work within Pakistan's public sector. This was its own kind of precision. These were people who had not known what they were part of, who had administered real vaccines to real children, who had been recruited into a deception they had not been equipped to identify or refuse. Their punishment was not for what they knew. It was for what they had been used to do. The Guardian published the story in July 2011, 10 weeks after the raid. The account detailed the fake vaccination campaign, the DNA collection objective, Afridi's role, and the operational structure of the program with enough specificity that it could not be officially denied. It wasn't officially denied. The CIA declined to comment. The White House declined to comment. The silence was its own confirmation. Within hours of publication, the story had moved into every major international news outlet. Within days, it had moved into something harder to contain than news coverage. It had moved into the existing architecture of distrust that had been building in Pakistan's tribal regions and border communities for years. This is where the decision made in the operations planning phase, to build the cover around a community's genuine medical vulnerability, produced its full cost. The operations architects had understood correctly that a real community need was the most effective available cover for what they were doing. What they had not fully modeled was what happens when that cover is exposed. When a lie is wrapped around something real, the exposure of the lie does not just discredit the lie. It contaminates the real thing the lie was wrapped around. Vaccination programs in Pakistan had already been operating under pressure from years of misinformation, rumors about sterilization, about Western interference, about needles that carried something other than medicine. Those rumors had been false. Health workers had spent years, in some cases careers, doing the slow, difficult, face-by-face work of countering them. Building trust in communities that had been given reasons to distrust, showing up repeatedly, consistently, in a way that demonstrated over time that the needle contained exactly what it claimed to contain. The CIA's program did not start those rumors, but it made them true. Not the specific rumors, not the sterilization claims, not the interference narratives, but the foundational premise underneath all of them, that a Western-backed vaccination program could have a purpose it was not disclosing. That was no longer a rumor after July 2011. That was a documented fact. The Taliban moved within months. Formal bans on polio vaccination were issued in multiple areas along the Pakistan-Afghanistan border. The bans were not framed in the language of public health skepticism. They were framed explicitly as a response to the Bin Laden operation. The CIA had used a vaccination program as a weapon. The Taliban was using that fact as a weapon of its own. The symmetry was not accidental. In parts of Khyber Pakhtunkhwa and the federally administered tribal regions, polio vaccination coverage collapsed. The disease, which had been in measurable retreat across both Pakistan and Afghanistan, resurged in areas that had previously been cleared. The World Health Organization tracked the numbers. The numbers were not ambiguous. Children were being paralyzed in regions that had been on the verge of polio eradication. In December 2012, 9 vaccination workers were killed in Pakistan over 2 days, men and women working for legitimate humanitarian organizations. People who had no connection to the CIA, no involvement in the Abbottabad program, no knowledge of anything beyond the work they had been trained to do. They were killed because the category they belonged to, vaccination worker, had been redefined. Not in their minds. Not in the minds of the organizations that employed them. In the minds of the communities they were trying to serve, and in the minds of the people who had decided those communities needed to be protected from them. The United Nations withdrew its vaccination teams from Pakistan. The withdrawal was not presented as a retreat. It was presented as a temporary security measure. It lasted years. In Washington, senators called for Afridi's release. Some tied his imprisonment to U.S. aid packages to Pakistan, suggesting that continued financial support was conditional on his freedom. The language used about him in American political discourse was consistent: hero, ally, asset who deserved protection. Pakistan's response was equally consistent. The man had committed treason, the case was a domestic legal matter, and American pressure would not determine its outcome. Afridi remained in prison. His assets remained seized. His family remained in an undisclosed location. The legal proceedings around his case shifted over the years, charges modified, appeals filed, jurisdictional arguments made, without producing resolution in either direction. He was, in the technical language of his situation, still pending. The CIA, which had recruited him through intermediaries specifically to maintain deniability, maintained its deniability. The man in prison and the agency that had used him occupied parallel tracks that never officially intersected. In May 2014, the White House announced that the CIA would no longer use vaccination programs as cover for intelligence operations. The announcement was 3 years after the operation, 13 months after 9 workers were murdered, years into a polio resurgence that public health officials were still trying to reverse. It was framed as a policy clarification. The global health community did not receive it as one. Médecins Sans Frontières, UNICEF, the WHO, and dozens of other organizations had spent the intervening years watching the operational damage spread beyond Pakistan, into communities in other countries where the story had circulated, where the confirmation that Western health programs could carry hidden agendas had become a reference point for existing suspicion. A policy announcement does not travel as fast or as far as the story that made it necessary. What Shakil Afridi understood, in whatever room he occupied in whatever facility held him, is not something any public record contains. He had been a doctor. He had been used as a cover, recruited through a chain that preserved deniability for everyone above him and left him at the point of maximum exposure. He had run a program that administered real vaccines to real children and failed to collect the intelligence it was designed to collect. He had been arrested for it, charged with treason for it, imprisoned for it, and the man the operation was designed to find had been located and killed by a completely different method, rendering the entire program retroactively unnecessary before its consequences had even fully begun. If you have followed this operation from the outer neighborhoods of Abbottabad to the chambers of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee to the paralysis wards of Pakistani hospitals, one thing becomes clear. The consequences of an intelligence operation are not contained within the operation. They spread into the systems the operation touched, medical, political, communal, and they spread in ways that the operation's architects are not present to manage, because by the time the consequences arrive, the architects have moved on to the next problem. The people who are present are the ones who were never told the full story. They are still there.